Can you imagine a world without electricity or running water or sanitation? Without the internal combustion engine or the cars, buses, trains and trucks and farm equipment they power? Can you imagine life without your smartphone now? Probably not. In the same way, life in the Roman Empire was inconceivable without slavery. Slaves made their entire world go round. They were an extremely cheap, plentiful workforce that underpinned everything. And I mean everything. As essential as they were, the life of a slave could be pretty grim in those days. They were under the total control of their masters and could be used and abused in any way their master saw fit. They were on call 24/7. Their life was not their own, and a slave could be physically disciplined or even used for the sexual gratification of their masters and exploited in that way. The quality of a slave's life was totally dependent on the whim of their master. And if you ran away and were caught, you could be severely beaten, but most likely you would be executed, probably crucified in public for everyone to see that that's not what a slave does. And if a runaway slave did come back and the master did do nothing to them, that master would become a laughing stock of their mates, or worse, seen as an enemy of society because they're threatening the status quo. Because of the cruelty of the institution of slavery in the Roman Empire, there were slave revolts. The largest and probably the most famous is the one led by Spartacus in the 70s BC. That revolt looked like it almost might get up. But the Roman elite could not allow it. They doubled down, and it was put down so brutally that it became a byword and a warning for the next 100 years, down to Paul's day. Because thousands of slaves were killed on the battlefield, and then a full 6,000 slaves were crucified and put up lining the main highway into Rome, the Appian Way. Can you imagine walking past 6,000 people instead of billboards hanging from a cross in various states of dying and decay? All of that is context for this letter which we've read this morning, where the Apostle Paul found himself lumped with a very tricky problem. The runaway slave Onesimus had landed on his doorstep, in prison of all places. Onesimus' name means literally useful, and you can imagine him being sold in the slave market. Oh, this one is useful. His name is Onesimus. He's a really good bargain. We aren't told why Onesimus ran away, but chances are, when we look at the way Paul talks about him, that Onesimus, a bloke whose name meant useful, had probably been about as useless as a one-legged man in a bum-kicking competition. Oni, I'm going to shorten his name for sake of convenience, Oni probably got into trouble from Phil for being repeatedly useless. And he couldn't take it anymore, and so he ran away. But since Oni has been with Paul, he has actually turned a corner and has been doing a tip-top job working to look out for the aging apostle and care for his needs while he's incarcerated. Don't forget, in those times, if you're locked in prison, there's not a nice television and air conditioning and 3 meals a day and some exercise. If no one comes to help you, your family and friends, you're going to die of starvation in prison. So Oni has been doing a top job as a servant to Paul in prison. But Paul knows that he can't stay there indefinitely as a runaway slave. So Paul does what Paul does best, writes a letter. Here's the interesting thing. Phil, with his wife Fee and son Archie, lived in Colossae. The church there met in their house So Paul writes a letter both to the whole congregation, which we have in the New Testament, Paul's letter to the church in Colossae, and on the side he privately writes to his dear mate Phil. In the general letter he wrote to the whole church, in his letter to the Colossian Christians, he writes in chapter 3 and into chapter 4, slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything and do it, not only when their eye is on you to curry favour, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs, and there is no favoritism. Masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. Paul knew that slavery was contrary to everything Jesus was about. But it was such an entrenched and pervasive institution that it was never going to be done away with overnight. In fact, it took centuries. So how would Christians work within this unjust and brutal system while simultaneously working towards its end? Slaves, see your masters as Jesus. Masters, look out properly for your slaves, because you yourself are not a master but a slave of the ultimate master, Jesus, and you are accountable to him for every action towards your slave. For Paul to say these things was kind of a big deal. No one in the ancient world told a man what to do with his stuff. And slaves were part of his stuff. And no one in the ancient world told a person with money and power what to do with their property either. In this letter to the whole church in Colossae, Paul is calling out slaves and masters, but he especially tells men how to treat their wives, how to treat their children, how to treat their slaves, because they themselves are personally accountable to Jesus. They can't just get away with whatever they like. So Phil and his family have to sit there in church under their own roof and hear these words read out to everyone, with everyone knowing that Oni ran away for being useless. But then they've also got this personal letter on the side. And in that letter, Paul lays it on nearly as thick as I lay butter on bread. He uses the word love a lot. Agape. The word for love in the ancient Greek lingo that is not about my feelings for another person, but about my choices towards them, choosing the benefit and the needs and the well-being of others above and beyond my own. The word for love always used to denote the kind of love Jesus has for us, and that he died for us. So Paul writes to Phil, you agape all the people in your church. You love all the people in your church. You made a choice for their well-being and benefit. You agape me. You look out for me, despite the fact I'm in prison. And I know how much you trust Jesus. So if you really are my partner in this gospel mission business, you know what you should do. I could command you to take this young bloke Oni back, but I am asking you to do it out of agape, out of love for this old man, because he's not useless anymore. So take him back, not as a slave, but as a brother. I will personally pay whatever out-of-pocket expenses he has caused you. I know you, I know you'll do it, and even more besides. I don't think he could have laid it on any thicker. But here's the real cheeky thing. Paul put this letter into the hands of a mate of his called Tyche, and he puts it into the hands of the runaway slave himself, Oni. Tyke and Oni then walked through Phil's front door with both letters in hand. Then they both would have sat in church, Phil and Oni, rest of the church together as Tyke read out this letter of the church to the church in Colossae about slaves and masters, with Oni sitting in the congregation right next to Phil after Phil had read this private letter. Talk about God doubling down on someone's conscience, right? Wow. Here's the cool thing. We know Phil must have taken Oni back, the master taking back the runaway slave, regardless of the negative consequences for his own social standing, because both of these letters made it into the Bible. If Phil thought this was a load of crap, he would have burned both letters and kicked these men out to the gutter, or maybe even worse, and we would not be having this conversation today. Because of letters like this, the church eventually managed to help bring about the end of one of the world's most evil and wicked institutions, the institution of slavery in many parts of the world. Phil had to let go of his social standing in Colossae. He had to forgive. He had to change. He had to make a choice for the well-being and benefit of others above and beyond his own. He had to love. So you're probably wondering, why choose this letter in a series about Holy Communion, about where it came from, why we're sharing it, and how we should approach it? You've probably been wondering, why have I got this sitting on the altar today? Does anyone know what this is? It's a spirit level, right? You put it on things to do what? Straighten them up and make sure they're on the level, right? The spirit level tells you if everything is on the level and not out of joint. It tells you if it's wonky donkey. This meal is God's spirit level. It acts in the same way. It tells us if people are on the level or if their relationships with people and with God is wonky donkey. This meal is God's spirit level, and it is a powerful leveler indeed. It's a good bet that Oni went back to working for Phil, and even though they may not have become mates or shared ordinary meals together, there is one meal table that they would inevitably, unavoidably share at in peace as equals: the Lord's table. It is one thing to say that people are all equal. It remains a theory, though, until you put it into practice and actually eat together. But not just any average, everyday meal. The meal Jesus gave us on the night he was betrayed. The meal consisting of his body and his blood. We can barely conceive of how radical and scandalous Jesus' meal was in its earliest days. This is why they were sometimes called love feasts. People choosing each other over every deeply ingrained attitude about race, gender, and social status. Jews and Gentiles sharing at table together. Men, women, and children sharing at table together. Slaves and masters sharing at table together. Slaves and masters sharing at this table. It is inevitable that the institution of slavery will come to an end. It is not possible for it to exist in a world where people gather around this table. This meal has been one of Jesus' main instruments to break down barriers that divide and bring healing and peace to the human race. This has been one of his main instruments to showcase his love. The equality we enjoy in so many parts of the world today is because of the transformative nature of this meal that Jesus gave us. Honestly, how many of us here, drawn from all walks of life and from all different parts of the world, would have ever shared at any table together if it wasn't for Jesus and his meal and his table? You don't need me to tell you that when you look at any source of news, that our society continues to fracture into ever smaller pieces. It is breaking apart. How many protests there are around the world, or how much violence and unhappiness and unrest. How many protests have been happening in this nation every weekend, it seems, over all manner of different causes that have upset and divided people. Given the anger still amongst many Aboriginal activists, it seems we have a long way to go to reconcile the children of colonists with the children of Aboriginal ancestors. And how many wars and conflicts are going around the world today? Well, I tell you, there is a place where it all can come to an end. There is a place where foes can become family, where every difference that divides us is done away with. This table, Jesus' table, Jesus' meal, his body broken for us, his blood poured out for us that we might be forgiven and forgive in turn. The grace of the Lord Jesus Christ be with your spirit. Let us pray.